Tonight is a very special night because from America we have a visit of Mr. Norman Standish. His wife and daughter are here as well, but Mr. Norman Standish is going to speak to us tonight. When I wrote to him in November, I never thought this would happen. I just thought we'd write, and I told him about Standish Festival, and he said he would love to come. And here he is. So, will you welcome Mr. Norman Standish?
Thank you very much. I really welcome the opportunity to be here. It's a little awe-inspiring to stand beside a pulpit that I'm sure Myles Standish probably had an opportunity to see when he was here in Standish too. What I'd like to do tonight is I'd like to go through and relate to you some of my relationship to Myles Standish and some of the things that the Standish family has done in America, which perhaps you're not as familiar with. I think if you remember back a couple of years ago, Lawrence Hill was here, and he had written a book, Gentlemen of Courage Forward. He sort of covered what I call the first half of the Standish family history, because he followed it from Norman invasion up to Myles, and what I'm going to try to cover tonight is really from Myles to Norman. So this is the second half. Myles Standish, people have asked me, you know, what is my impression? What do I think Myles Standish looked like in that? Actually, I think that probably in terms of stature, he was probably somewhat shorter than I am, or perhaps about the same height. And I say that because my son is about the same height that I am. My father was just about the same height I am. My grandfather was about the same height, and my great-grandfather was about the same height. So at least in 5 generations, there hasn't been much change in height, and I'm the 10th generation from Myles Standish, so I have to assume that those other 5 generations didn't change the height very much either. One of the things I do know about Myles is that he had bright red hair, and my daughter has red hair. I know her sitting in the audience here this evening, so we still have some red hair in the family. Also, Myles was sort of known for his short temper. A number of occasions this came through during his life and different incidents that he was involved in. But I know on the Mayflower, when he sailed with the Pilgrims and that many of the sailors taunted the Pilgrims, and one of the things they did, they used to call Myles Captain Shrimp. However, I doubt that they really called him that to his face, because I'm sure he would have gotten very mad. But sometimes you also hear him referred to as the chimney with a short fire. In other words, he got irritated very easily. He worked with the colony and was the military leader. He actually was not a pilgrim himself, never did join the faith, so he was classified as a stranger. And on the passengers on the Mayflower, there were saints and there were strangers, and the saints were members of the faith, and the strangers were those who did not follow the faith. So you had the combination of the two people. There were actually quite a few of the strangers that came from the London area, and this was primarily due to the fact that the adventurers, or the people that financed the colony in America, actually had a strong voice in saying who was going or who was going to be involved in creating this new colony in America. So they stipulated that some of these people from London would be included in the passenger list. Many of these were orphans or people that didn't have family in that were included as members to develop this colony in America. The adventurers, from their point of view, it was really a financial venture, because they were expecting to receive a profit from this, and they were going to profit from all of the furs that were obtained by trading with the Indians. So they were actually expecting a financial return on this. Now the Pilgrims, and really they were called Separatists at that time because the name Pilgrim really didn't come into play until many years later in America. They became titled as Pilgrims, but actually they were regarded as Separatists then and wanted to separate in order to worship in their own fashion. Now, the Separatists, of course, came because of religious convictions that they had, and they wanted to settle. They wanted to settle because they felt they were English citizens. They wanted to maintain their English heritage, and they had been in Holland, and although the Dutch treated them well in that, they really felt that their children, as they were growing up, were losing their English heritage, and therefore they wanted to break out and found their own colony. And at that time, there were three places that they considered. One of them was Guyana in South America, originally known as British Honduras, Belize, which is in Central America, and Plymouth, well, it really wasn't Plymouth, it was Northern Virginia that they were headed. Virginia as a site, and probably were strongly influenced by the fact that John Smith had started Jamestown. He had started Jamestown in 1608, and Jamestown was founded, all male members, and had gotten into problems with the Indians and had been almost wiped out. And at that time it was floundering and didn't look like it was going to survive. But he had made maps, and he had mapped the whole area of what they call Virginia in the New World, and these maps were really the basis of what everyone was looking at in terms of founding a colony. Now, the really significant thing about the colony I found was this was the first permanent English colony that was established on the North American coast. It also had some other firsts in the respect that it was the first colony established that there were both men and women involved. Prior to that time, they had been all men in the colonies they had attempted to establish. And there were something like 7 or 8 colonies that had been attempted prior to that time, and all of them had failed completely and been abandoned. So it was not a new, they weren't going out into totally unexpected, but they certainly were facing extreme hardships. Now they recognized this fact, and of the people that were going to come to the New World, they selected the ones that they felt were the strongest and capable of handling the hardships that were involved in founding a new colony of this type, and the rest were going to stay and follow later, and there was a plan as to when these people were to come behind them. In actual fact, many things came into play that changed the courses of events for these people, and some of them really started right very early. There are also a number of mysteries, and there are a number of mysteries associated with Myles Standish that have evolved over the years, and still are mysteries today that no one really knows the real answer to. One of those is the question of where Myles Standish was born. Certainly there have been a lot of articles that express the fact that he was born in this immediate area. There's others that say he was born in the Isle of Man. In actual fact, there never has been a birth certificate actually identified. So no one really knows exactly where he was born. I think there's no question that he did live on the Isle of Man. He certainly lived in this area and received much of his education in this general area. When he was young, he received a commission as a second lieutenant from Queen Elizabeth I. He went to Holland. He fought against the Spanish in Holland. At that time, he was wounded and was in the hospital in Holland for some period of time. And that's really during the period of time that he actually came into contact with the Pilgrims. And he got to know some of the Pilgrims during the period, particularly when he was in the hospital. Now, when he came back from the wars, at that time the Pilgrims were organizing to found this colony in the New World, and they have done several things. One of the things they have done is they petitioned King James I for a license for a colony. Now, after a considerable amount of effort in that, this was refused, and basically he said that he wouldn't interfere with them. that they could go and they could found a colony and he wouldn't interfere in any way at all, but he would not give them a license. So therefore, when they went, they were totally dependent upon the adventurers or these investors because they had a license or a patent for the land in Northern Virginia. And this is where the colony was going to be founded. Now, they came on a ship, the Speedwell, from Holland to Southampton. Now, the Speedwell was a ship that they purchased, and what they did is all of the members that were actually going to go on the voyage to found this colony, they sold their property and pooled their funds in that in order to buy the Speedwell. Now, in addition to the Speedwell, they also chartered the Mayflower, and the Mayflower was to meet them at Southampton, and these two ships would take them to the new colony that they were going to find. When they got to Southampton and they made their preparations to sail, they had several things happen to them. One, Brewster, who had printed some books that were brought into England in wine case and that smuggled into England, had a price on his head, and so he was hidden, and they hid him in the hold of the ship with the cast and that were there. Also, when they left, by English law at that period of time, you had to have a cooper, and the cooper was required in order to maintain the cask where the food and water was stored, and no ship could leave port unless they hired a cooper. Well, they hired a cooper who was John Alden from Southampton, so he was hired. Now, they had also hired Myles Standish as the military leader. He was sort of the second choice, actually, because they first approached John Smith, and John Smith wanted more money than they could afford to pay, so they couldn't afford to pay him the fee that he wanted, so they settled on Myles Standish, and Myles Standish became the military leader for them. Now, when they sailed out of Southampton, the Speedwell began to leak. And after they were out one day, they had to turn back again in order to recaulk the seams on the Speedwell. They repaired it, and then they left again, and it leaked again. Now, there are many stories related to why the Speedwell leaked. They didn't have any trouble coming from Holland. It seemed to be fine, but when they got to the southern part of England, it seemed to be a leaky ship and was finally declared unseaworthy, and they had to abandon it at Dartmouth. Now, one of the accounts of this is the fact that they bought the Speedwell and they contracted the sailors who were to go to the New World and be there for 3 years, and they were to sail up and down the coast to trade with the Indians and collect these furs that were going to bring the return to the investors. Well, these sailors have second thoughts, and it's speculated that what they did is they actually put more sail than the ship could handle. And as a result, it would force the ship to leak because it would cause the mast to bend more than it was supposed to. And as a result, it would appear as if it was a leaky ship in that. Well, it ended up that none of those sailors had to go, and the only sailors that did go were the sailors that were on the Mayflower, which was a charter boat. Now, the Mayflower was to come over, leave the Pilgrims, and then come back. And they were not going to stay there at all. The Mayflower did not have a problem, so it did sail. But what happened, they had to consolidate all of the people that were on the Speedwell and the Mayflower onto one ship. Now, obviously, there wasn't enough room. Some of them decided to stay. Some of them felt it was an ill omen, the fact that the ship was leaking and that. So they actually decided to stay in England, and many of them did stay in England at that time. Now, for those that did sail, they were on the sea roughly a month. During that period of time, it was a stormy season of the year because they'd been delayed for almost 8 weeks getting out. They were delayed because they didn't have enough money to pay the fee to leave the harbor, and there was a fee charge for leaving the harbor. So what they had to do is they unloaded their tubs of butter that they had and sold the butter in Southampton in order to raise enough money in order to pay the fees so they could actually leave the harbor. But they left the harbor and sailed. The only difficulty they had with the Mayflower was that the storms were so intense as they were sailing that they broke one of the main support beams that supported the mast. And they were very fortunate they had a printing press, and they took the screw off the printing press and used that to force the beam back up into place, and that, so that they were able to continue on the journey to the New World. Now, they went the northern route. Many people question, why did they go the northern route? They were late in the year. It was a stormy season, so that they knew they were heading directly into the North Atlantic when storms were very severe in that. But the reason they went north was because the southern route, which would have taken them to the West Indies and been much more calm and easy to sail, was full of pirates. And many of the Spanish ships were in that area, and they were raiding English ships that would come across. And of course, if they were raided, they had the potential of losing all their possessions and even possibly their life. So they went the northern route in spite of all of the storms and that they faced. So they deliberately knew they were going into a severe condition. Now, when they got to the coast of America, they were supposed to found a colony in Northern Virginia. Now, Northern Virginia was very poorly defined because the maps that John Smith had created actually encompassed a very large area for what they called Virginia, much greater than it is today in the state of Virginia. So it's sort of ill-defined exactly where they were going, but it would appear that they were destined to go someplace near the Jamestown settlement that had been settled before. In actual fact, they hit land above Cape Cod and then sailed around Cape Cod into the shoals. Now, the shoals is a very, very intense sea area of rocks and whitewater rapids in the area. And when they went into this area, they turned and went back up to the Cape. Well, they eventually landed on the Cape at, near what's called Provincetown today. From there, they had a small scallop that they had in the ship that they took off to explore the coastline in the area. And they did a lot of exploring by land. Myles Standish led expeditions all around trying to contact the Indians in the area because they wanted to trade with the Indians. However, they weren't able to find any Indians. Every time they would find a campfire, the coals would still be warm in there, but the Indians were gone. Every time they saw the pilgrims coming, why, they would always disappear. Now, they finally, after searching the area and that, decided to move farther in towards what is Plymouth today, and that's where they eventually decided to build a colony. But by this time, it was late November, December, and in New England, you can have very, very severe storms at that time of the year, and they have these northeasters that come down, and sleet and rain, ice, and as history goes, it appears that that winter happened to be one of the most severe winters that's been recorded on the East Coast. So they headed right into an extremely severe winter period. Now, the Mayflower was to leave them and come back, but Captain Christian agreed that he would stay over the winter so that they could actually live on the boat until they were able to build shelters and houses so that they could stay there. Now, why did they end up there? Well, again, it's sort of a mystery because Thomas Weston, who was the leader of the adventurers that had invested money in this, he had control of land and patent to land in the Northern Virginia area, but it just happens to turn on that he also had the patent for the land in the Plymouth area. So there's much speculation in the fact that they really never ever intended to go south, and that's the reason they actually hit shore above Cape Cod, because the captain of the ship certainly was a much better sailor and could have hit much closer to where he wanted to hit land if he had really intended to. So there's sort of a mystery about that. When they landed on the land, they again went and explored the area in that. And one of the reasons they selected that area is because the land had been cleared off and there were cornfields planted there. The Indians had planted corn in the area. However, again, they saw no sign of the Indians. The Indians weren't around. Well, they found dirt mounds in these cornfields, and they dug into these dirt mounds, and they found straw baskets, woven baskets, which were filled with corn. And this is the way the Indians used to store corn. They would harvest the corn and put it in the baskets and then bury it under the soil. And then when they needed it, they'd go back and they'd dig this up out of the mounds. Well, they took this corn out, intending to compensate the Indians for it. Their only problem was they couldn't find any Indians to compensate because the Indians would keep disappearing on them all the time. Well, they stayed on the ship that winter and survived on the food they had brought with them. But as you can imagine, being cramped up in this small, and it really is very small. There's a ship, a replica of the Mayflower, which is in Plymouth today, and you can go on that and tour through it. It's part of the Plymouth Plantation, they call it. I've been there, and for me to walk on the deck where they were living, I have to stoop my head over. It's so low in order to walk there. And of course, it's not really that wide. So there were 102 people cramped in this extremely small space. All of their worldly possessions, any furniture they had, any clothes they had, plus all their food supply and everything that they were going to live in, were all cramped in this extremely small quarter. Well, as you can appreciate, the pilgrims began getting sick, and they had what they call the Great Illness. Today, when we look at the medical records in that, it would appear that it was probably scurvy that they were suffering from. But they started to die, and they were very concerned because the Indians were lighting bonfires on the shore every night and holding these ceremonies which they considered hostile, and they didn't want to let them know how many people were dying. So each night, as people would die, they would take and lower them over the side to a longboat and take them in, and they would bury them on what they call Burial Hill. It was a hill that was covered with grass sod, and they dig the sod up and bury the people in a common grave, and then re-sod it so that you couldn't tell that anyone was buried there, so that they couldn't count how many people were dying. But in that period of time that they were on the boat that winter, roughly half of them died. So they started out with 102, and 52 of them died that first winter from what they call the Great Illness. One of those that died was Barbara Standish, Myles Standish's wife, and she was one of the first to actually die. Actually, it was so bad for a period of time that at one time there were only 4 of them that were able to stand and care for the others and feed the others. Most of them were so weak in that they actually couldn't stand or couldn't feed themselves anymore. When spring came, obviously their ranks were diminished considerably. The original agreement that they had with the adventurers was that all of the property belonged to the adventurers. If they built a house, that belonged to the adventurers. If they had tools, that belonged to the adventurers. Any food they raised belonged to the adventurers. So they had basically a communist society where everyone turned everything they raised into a common long house, which they built, and then everybody was rationed an equal portion from this long house. Now, the agreement was that when they paid the debt plus the interest on the debt, then they would have an opportunity to bid to buy the houses and that they had built. But prior to that time, everything belonged to the adventurers. Well, this went on the first year, and productivity was very low. They almost starved to death that first year, and Bradford, on his own, made the decision, and he took and allocated land to each family, and then each family raised their food for their needs and that. And from that time on, they didn't have the problem that they had prior to that time in terms of productivity in the colony. So that was a very significant move on his part. Another very significant move on the part of the Pilgrims was that they created a document which they called the Mayflower Compact. And they created this because they had no patent from the King of England to found a colony, so they didn't technically fall under English law. So what they did is they drew up this compact, and all of the male members on the boat signed that compact before they left the boat. And basically it said, number one, they believed in God. Two, they were loyal subjects of King James I of England. And three, that they would all abide by the common laws that they would create in the future. And they did create some very unique laws for that period of time. In England, there were 70-some offenses that were capital punishment, where they would hang you. Under their laws, there were only 5 offenses that someone could be hanged. Under their laws, everyone was entitled to a jury for settling disputes and for punishment for crimes and that. Whereas in England at that time, only nobility were entitled to a jury trial. They established the recording of deeds, birth certificates, death certificates for everyone. Everyone was treated equally under the law from their point of view. So there were some very novel aspects which have actually continued on and are part of American law even today. So that's one of the very basic documents in the United States in terms of establishing some of the principles on which the laws have been written since that time. So that's a very important contribution on their part. Well, after they started building houses, first of all, when they laid out what they were going to build on this colony, they had laid out a number of houses, and each family that was created with the members of an immediate family, plus orphans that were assigned to it, plus any unmarried members that were in the group. So everybody was assigned to a family, and they had a large number of houses. Well, by the next spring, they only needed half as many houses. So the workload in terms of building houses was substantially reduced to the number that had perished in that first winter. So they ended up and they built 17 houses. One of the things most people don't realize is many of the early settlements in America that they were built, people built what they called log cabins. They cut trees and notched trees in order to build a crude type of cabin. Actually, the houses that the Pilgrim built, they actually cut and sawed boards by hand, so that those houses were all built as board or plank type houses and that, and don't look very much different than the houses you see in the United States today, which is really amazing that they went to that effort at that period of time. In addition to building houses, another thing, each member of the colony was required to put in a certain amount of time for defense. And under Myles, they built a platform, and they had a cannon, a 2 small cannon that they brought. Those were mounted to face out over the harbor. And again, to ward off pirates, because the Spanish from the southern part of the United States would come along and they would burn down these colonies and destroy everything there. So the guns were really for the pirates and not really for the Indians. Well, while they were in the process of doing this and building this village, out of the woods one day walked an Indian and walked right into the group where they were working. And of course they'd been trying to make contact with the Indians, and they were bewildered. And what really surprised them was this Indian spoke English, and he spoke perfect English. Now the reason he spoke English was because there were a lot of fishing villages along the coast at that time, and these fishing groups would come over and they'd fish in the summer and salt fish and then ship it back to Europe or England. Now he was captured by some of these fishermen and taken to Spain, and he escaped in Spain and worked his way to England, and he had lived with an English family for 2 years. And then he went back, made his way back to America. But when he got back there, his tribe had lived in the Plymouth area, but they were all gone. They completely disappeared. And the cornfields that the Pilgrims found actually had been placed there by the tribe that he was a member of. Now, they don't know what happened to that tribe, but at that period of time, many times a disease would sweep through a tribe, say like measles. And the Indians were very susceptible to measles, and suddenly the whole tribe would be just wiped out by a disease like that. Another thing that quite frequently happened is there were frequent Indian wars in that area, and many tribes were fighting other tribes, and it was custom with the Indian tribes that if you conquered another Indian tribe, you killed everyone, all the women, children, everybody. So everybody was killed, and a tribe would just disappear, literally. Any prisoners that you did take, they were slaves for the rest of their life. So it could have been any one of those things that contributed to the disappearance of the tribe on this Indian. Now, Squanto came and he lived with the Pilgrims. He stayed right with them. And he introduced them to other Indians, and one of the Indians was King Massasoit. He was the king of a number of tribes in the area. King Massasoit became their friend, and he sent his Indian to live with the Pilgrims, Hokomo, and he lived right with the Pilgrims. And he lived with Myles Standish throughout his entire lifespan. So there were Indians that were right with the Pilgrims and lived right with the Pilgrims and were a great asset to them, because the next spring, when it came time to plant, the Pilgrims had brought along with them 16 different types of seeds from England that they were going to plant, or from Holland that they were going to plant. They also had this corn that they had dug up from the hills. Now, Squanto knew how to plant this corn, and every spring in March on the coast of New England, the waves wash up alewives fish. And these alewives fish, you can walk along and pick them up. They're just a small fish. And it was the custom of the Indian that they would plant the corn by putting 5 seeds in a hill, and they put 1 fish in and then cover it up, and that would fertilize the corn so it would grow. And then the corn would thrive. Well, they planted all of these seeds that they had, and at the end of the first year, the only crop that they collected gainful crop from was the corn that they planted. All of the seeds they brought with them, the growing season was too short, the soil wasn't proper, there was something wrong in every case, and they just did not grow productively. So they were very, very fortunate, first of all, to have found this corn when they arrived, but secondly, to have found and build a relationship with the Indians so that the Indians could show them how to actually plant this corn, or certainly they would have starved to death in that first year if it wouldn't have been for that. Well, when April came around, they had planted their crops, they had the crops in the ground, and it was time for the Mayflower to go back. Well, Captain Christian was convinced that there was no way that the colony could survive. They had lost so many members at that point in time. They had nothing to return on the ship, and the agreement was that the Mayflower was to return with furs on it. They still hadn't established any level of trading with the Indians. They were having enough trouble just surviving, let alone try to trade with anybody for furs and that. So they were in very poor straits in terms of building a colony, continuing a colony. So they assembled and they asked each member individually if they wanted to stay. And everyone indicated that they wanted to stay, that they would not return. So they stayed to build that colony. Now, the first year they planted their crops, and everything went well, and they prospered. The ducks came back, the geese came back in the summertime. There were all sorts of wild nuts and berries in the area, so they by the time fall rolled around, they had plentiful supplies. And they were really blessed, so they decided to have a fall festival, very much as the fall festival that you're having right now. And this fall festival was 3 days long. And they invited the Indians to come. King Massasoit came, and he brought 100 braves with him. Well, Myles Standish had an army of 9 men, and it was their responsibility to keep track of the 100 Indian braves that also came to celebrate this fall festival. They had, the Indians brought 5 deer, they had fowl, they had eels, they had all sorts of various foods in that for this banquet, and they had a tremendous big banquet, and the women cooked continuously for 3 days while this was going on. And they had games, they had wrestling matches with the Indians, they shot bows and arrows at targets, they fired muskets, and all of these various things. They played kickball. One of the students today asked me what kickball was. They have a ball that they kick around, and I doubt that it was very much different really than your soccer game that you played. But Pilgrims were amazed at how similar some of the games the Indians played were to games that they had played in England, and the Indians were surprised at how similar the games of the white man were to the games played. So they got along well those 3 days, and and everything went very well, and everybody went home. Then within a couple of weeks after that, the second ship came in, and the second ship was to be the supplies to carry them over that winter, and the adventurers were to supply this ship, the Anne, when it came over. Well, when the Mayflower came back and had no furs on it, and they didn't make any profit off it, they were mad. So when they sent the Anne, they didn't send any supplies. And instead of sending supplies, what they did is they sent 30 more people that they recruited in London. These people had no cooking utensils, they had no tools, they had no clothes except for what they were wearing when they arrived. So suddenly they had 30 more people, whereas all of their supplies had been allocated for the 52 people that they had to start with. So immediately they had to start rationing. And they had to ration their food through that winter, and it got very severe. By the time they got to the next spring, the average ration per person per day was 5 kernels of corn. So that was the most severe winter that they had. And in the United States, there's a society of Mayflower descendants today, and these are all people that have proved their lineage from a member that came on the Mayflower. And beside each plate at that banquet in the fall is 5 kernels of corn to remind everybody of the hardship that the Pilgrims went through at that time. They did survive, and of course they planted their crops. They harvested a bountiful crop that year, and that was the last time really that they suffered from hunger. They actually prospered from that point on. But their biggest problem then was paying the debt back to the adventurers. They had a representative from the Pilgrims that was communicating with the adventurers in England and going back and forth. Every time he came to England, there was always some reason it took much longer than they expected. And he also bought supplies for himself, and it seemed like every time he came back, all of the supplies for the colony were damaged by water and that, but his never got damaged. He prospered very well, and the Pilgrims kept going deeper and deeper into debt. Finally, they got fed up with this and said, gee, this is not the way to do it. And so what eventually evolved was that Myles Standish and 4 of the others became undertakers, and they signed a note for the debt for the colony. They assumed the full debt of the colony themselves. And in return for this, by mutual agreement, they agreed that they would control all of the fur trade with the Indians, and they would set up trading posts all the way up the coast into Maine and that. Well, this worked very well, although they ran into some problems because the French would come down from the Canadian areas, and several times they burnt down the trading post that they'd established with the Indians. And of course the French wanted to trade with the Indians and didn't want the English trading with the Indians, so there was a bit of a conflict there for some period of time, but eventually did get along. Give you an idea of some of the character of Myles. One of the other Pilgrims, Edward Doty, who I'm also descended from, he fought the first duel in the colony, and he and a fellow by the name of Lester fell in love with the same girl, and they got into an argument, so they went down to the beach and they had this duel, and they actually drew blood. Well, Myles heard that they were fighting at the beach and that, so he dashed down and broke them up and marched them up to Bradford's cabin, and Bradford was the governor of the colony, and so for punishment he dictated that they be hung by their heels for 24 hours. So they strung these two guys up by their heels for 24 hours, but obviously they didn't like it, and they made so much noise and such a ruckus in that they finally cut them down and gave them a strong reprimand, and eventually Lester left the colony, went to New York, but Doughty did stay with the colony in that. But that was typical of the kind of things that you'd find Myles Standish involved in the colony. But I've rambled on quite a bit here, and I really want to have an opportunity to address the things that you're particularly interested in. So maybe I ought to stop just a minute and open it up to questions, if there are any questions anyone has. Is there any particular thing that you'd like to know more about? Anyone have a question? Okay, no questions. Let me tell you a little bit about the Standish family then, because there were more than Myles, as I can testify by standing here. As I mentioned when I was talking about the height of people, there has been a male in the family line all the way down from Myles. I have a son who's at the university right now, and I have two daughters. I had one sister. My father had three sisters. My grandfather had five sisters. And so the line has been rather perilous in terms of maintaining the Standish name. But we have maintained it at least through the generations. Now the Standishes, Myles, of course, devoted his entire life to the colony. And although he never became a pilgrim, he was a clerk for the colony. He was also the acting governor of the colony. And he came to England in 1625 as a representative for the colony. And he was one of the underwriters to assume the debt for the colony. So he really involved himself totally and became a member of that colony. His eldest son was Alexander. And he has two sons from which there were descendants. Alexander was the oldest. Joshua was the younger son. And they both have descendants, and there are descendants today in the United States from both. Now, he also had a son, John, who died as an infant, another son, Charles, that died as an infant, and he had a daughter that died at a very young age. So there were quite a few children in that generation. Now, Alexander lived in Duxbury, the same place where Myles essentially built his farm and lived through his later period in life. Alexander created a general store, which he operated out of their home there, and eventually that home burnt, but the foundation is still there. You can see the foundation stones of the house that he built. Now, they did trading, and to do trading, you needed boats in order to get up and down the coast to trade with the Indians. So they built boats, and they launched them at Plymouth, but the water was relatively shallow there. So the size of boat that they could launch was limited. And as trade increased and boats got bigger and bigger, they needed deeper water. So Alexander's oldest son, James, moved to Warren, Maine, and in Warren, Maine, they had deep water, and they also had tall pine trees. Now, the pine trees were used for the mast, and they built clipper ships. And so the Standish family, for about 5 generations, built clipper ships and sailed clipper ships around the world. And that was really their strength. Now, there were 2 major shipbuilding families that were building clipper ships at that time, and that was the Weston family and the Standish family. My middle name is Weston. The families intermarried through history. When steel ships came along and steam engines, they didn't believe steel ships were going to float, and they didn't believe steam engines would ever be safe. So they continued building clipper ships until clipper ships became obsolete, essentially. And as a result, the Standish family fortune deteriorated with time as they continued to build clipper ships when they really didn't need clipper ships anymore. Now, my great-grandfather came west, and he came west seeking his fortune, essentially, and he heard that the railroads were hiring blacksmiths, and he was trained as a blacksmith. And he went to the terminus of the railroads, which was the end of the railroads in central United States in Oxford Junction, Iowa, a very small town in the center of Iowa, and got a job as a blacksmith on the railroad, and then eventually went into farming and farmed in that area. My grandfather worked on that railroad, and he was a conductor on that railroad. My father worked on that railroad, he was a signalman, and I worked on that railroad when I was in school. And our family home, my house that I have in Illinois, the railroad runs right in front of my house. So we were railroaders for a number of years. I'm the only one that's departed from that because I'm trained as a scientist and work for a petroleum company in Cleveland, Ohio. So we've been if there's one characteristic that I have to point out about the Standish family is we're very persistent. And we really stick with things, even though they might not look like the best thing in the world to stick with. And I can say that very truthfully because my family home I've converted into a bed and breakfast, and I've tried to collect all the things I can find from the Standish family so that people can come there and see them. And when I had my open house, older woman asked me, gee, how long have you been working on this to get this house in shape? And I said, well, between my father and I, roughly about 40 years, we've just working and rebuilding that house in order to get it into the shape that it's in today. So again, I think we still have this characteristic of being tenacious and sticking with things for a long time. Interesting sidelight on that is that we are not the only descendants of the Mayflower descendants that moved into that area. Just north of where I live, about 30 miles, is a town called Winslow. And Winslow, the main street is Bradford, cross streets are Brewster and Alden. There are many Bradfords buried in the cemetery there. But that was because the Boston Land Company owned a tract of land there, and this was all Indian land originally. And when the Black Hawk Indian treaties were signed in that area, and the Indians moved west of the Mississippi River, that land opened up, and one of the areas they went to was the area of Plymouth to sell land, because the families had grown so large that land was very limited and very limited opportunity. And also the farmland was not very good in that area because the growing season was so short. So here was very good farmland and that, so they went down and they sold. And all of these descendants of the Pilgrims went down around up the Mississippi River to Galena, Illinois, and then by wagon over into this area of Winslow where they settled. So there are many descendants of the Mayflower in that general area because of that reason. So there are many twists. Another interesting sidelight that you might be interested in, I mentioned that Myles was originally married to Barbara, and she was listed on the manifest as Barbara Standish. However, Rose, when she came on the end on the second shift, her last name was never identified on the manifest on the ship. And as a result, we don't know who Rose really was. And there's been a lot of speculation over the years as to who Rose might be. But it's been reported that she was a sister to Barbara. And some evidence tends to indicate that they were probably cousins and that their last name was Standish also. And that may have been one of the reasons that their name was not manifest listed as Standish's. So that's sort of a mystery. Another mystery that I've been involved with myself is Standish Hall. The Tudor section of Standish Hall was sold at auction and bought by an anonymous buyer in the United States. It was shipped to the United States, but it's never appeared in the United States. And so no one really knows exactly where that is, where that Tudor section of the house is today. And there have been many attempts to try to locate it, but nobody has been able to actually find it. About a year ago, a man stayed at my bed and breakfast, and I have a painting of Standish Hall in the front room, and he saw that, and he said, gee, I know a family in Detroit, Michigan that says that they have paneling at Standish Hall that was from the original Tudor section of the house, from the library. And so I contacted these people and talked to them, and they wouldn't let me see it because they said that their insurance company had told them they didn't want anybody to see it and they didn't want anybody taking any photographs of it or writing anything about it. However, I convinced them that gee, being in Standish, I'd have an opportunity to see it. So they did let me in to see it, and I was surprised to find it was all walnut. And so I took some pictures of it, and then I sent it to some people who I knew who had lived in Standish Hall, and they came back and verified to me that all of the paneling in Standish Hall was oak, and that there wasn't any walnut there. So I don't know how that got identified specifically with Standish Hall, but it may have come from some other structure on the lands, not from the Standish Hall itself. But that's sort of another mystery that's happened. Now the furnishings from the house, actually the disposal of those, the artworks and everything that was included in the house, were given to the King of England, and they went into the Louvre, and there was a section in the Louvre called Standish Museum where they were exhibited for a period of time. Then they were returned to England and sold at auction at Christie's, and Oscar Hammer and his brother bought them at auction. And they brought them to the United States, and they rented the 5th floor of Macy's department store in New York City and auctioned them off. And I called Oscar Hammer one time and talked to him, and also I think you probably know Lawrence Hill, when he was writing his book, had contacted him and had a letter from him. He was unable to identify the individual that he had sold them to, but he did know that he had sold most of them to a couple from Ohio. But none of those possessions have ever really shown up in the United States either, so they've all sort of disappeared, or we've lost track of them and don't know where they really went to. So that's sort of another mystery. Now, Oscar Hammer has since died, so we'll never find out from him, and he couldn't remember the name of the individuals that he sold it to anyway. But again, I'll stop again. Are there any questions or anything specifically people like to ask?
Yes, Myles. When Myles Standish came back to Britain in 1625, did he spend much time here at all?
Yes, he did spend, it was a time when the Great Plague was going around, and he was to negotiate with the adventurers at that time. Because of the plague in that, he wasn't able to travel around, so he was here for some period of time. And it's a strange incident because there is a painting that's supposedly Myles Standish. It's been used by Ethel Harper as an illustration on the cover of her book. He could well have sat for a painting while he was here in England, because the painting does have 1625 on it, but it has no other identification in terms of artist or anything on it. And so he was here, and was here for a period of time in 1625, and that's pretty well documented and established. That painting hung in the New York Metropolitan Library for a while, and it was in the Pilgrim Museum for a while, and the last I heard of it was in a safe in Boston because the New England Historical Society was trying to authenticate it, and they had not been very successful in really authenticating it. But see, the reason it would be strange, one, the Pilgrims did not believe in images, so none of the Pilgrims outside of Winslow had paintings that had been made before he became a Pilgrim, but none of the Pilgrims had images made or paintings made of them. So that was the first thing. Now, the counter to that is the fact that Myles never was a Pilgrim, so he could well have sat for a painting and not had that influence in it at all. So it's not known, but yes, he was here and was here for a period of time. Where he was during that period of time is not well documented. They don't know. But I think it's quite probable that he spent time in this area during that period of time.
Thank you.
Did he have any estates now the Duxbury or Elevator, or even perhaps Standish left for America? And what did he do with it?
Well, see, he was in Holland and he was wounded, and again, there's some not well-established facts involving that, but he had a cousin, William, and this cousin, William, and he were raised by the grandfather. His parents both died when he was very young, and his grandfather lived on the Isle of Man. Now, when he was in the hospital and wounded, it was reported by the cousin to the grandfather that he had died, and so the grandfather changed the will. So when Myles came back, the cousin had occupied all of the lands and that really would have been claimed by Myles. And I think this, well, personally, I think this probably influenced his decision in going with the Pilgrims, because I can imagine he came back, he had been wounded, he was recovering, he probably had no money to contest this at all. Here was an opportunity for him to earn some money so that he could reclaim his lands and that again. In actual fact, he went to America and he became totally engrossed and never did come back again. But he obviously claimed these lands, because when he died, in his will, he claimed that he was a member of Standish family. He claimed Standish Hall. He claimed properties in Ormskirk. He claimed properties on the Isle of Man, including Ellenbane. So he identified a number of different properties in his will. Now, After he had died, Alexander tried to lay claim to many of those lands, but the statute of limitations had run out on them by then. And then later on in years, there were actually a group of descendants who tried to lay claim to lands. But the interesting thing, that group of descendants hired a lawyer, and that lawyer tried to claim Duxbury. Now, Myles never actually claimed the Duxbury line in his will, although he claimed some properties that could be common to both. So, again, it's a little hazy as to where it actually falls. But certainly there's no question he claimed Standish Hall and properties in the general area of Standish. So I think there's a true claim there, certainly. Mm-hmm.
What do you think, therefore, of the claim that the Chorley Parish Register was defaced to deprive him of his inheritance?
Yeah, again, that's one of the sort of mysteries surrounding Myles. There seems to be a lot of mysteries about it. There's no question I've looked at that document myself. Certainly, it's a faded page and it's washed out in that. It's in the right sequence of time when you might have expected Myles to be born in that. But again, there's no real way you can establish it one direction or the other. You know, his name might have been there, but it might not have. I think there's some other possible explanations. No birth certificate has really shown up, but then records were very scattered in that period of time. Also, the Standish even over a long period of time, maintained a strong Catholic influence, and it's quite possible that there might be a baptismal record within Catholic documents too. No one really knows, but no birth certificate has ever shown up. Now they've just recently, within the last year now, located the will of his father, and that was registered on the Isle of Man, in the documents on the Isle of Man. But in that document, he designates things to his children, but he doesn't identify any children, so he doesn't identify Myles or anyone else. And see, his father's name was John, his grandfather's name was John, and there were other Johns. So there, you know, again, the dates are in the right sequence to be his father. Obviously, the individual did die young, and in the sequence of time that Myles' father would have died in that. But again, you know, you have this question: is it the real John Standish? John seems to be a common name. My grandfather's name was John Standish too. Now, another mystery that's always intrigued me is, where did the name Myles come from? Because all the way through the line, when I look at all the names and that have been used by Standish, there are a lot of Johns, a lot of Ralphs, Williams, everything else. But that's the only Myles in the whole thing. And I don't know. I've asked many people that question, and no one has really been able to give me an answer. I don't know where the name Myles came from. But I'm sure there must be a reason for it. Yes?
Why do you think he called his settlement Duxbury?
I'm sorry?
Why do you think he called his settlement Duxbury?
Well, actually, that's an interesting thing because it is in a swampy area, and there are a lot of ducks around there, and so there's a big question. The interesting thing is, though, that he named it Duxbury before they called it Duxbury Hall. And so the establishment of the colony, of the town of Duxbury in the colony, actually occurred prior to the time that the title of Duxbury Hall was adopted. So to me, I don't see a strong connection because of that. And it's just that the dates don't fit together. They're not in the right sequence. But also, there is this whole question, there were swamps and ducks and all this sort of thing around, and he may just have called it Duxbury, you know. I don't know. I don't know where the name came from, really. But that's where he lived out the rest of his life, and many of the pilgrims did, because the pilgrims, as so often happens, as the colony developed and prospered, it increased, the number of people increased, and they became very uncomfortable with that arrangement. So they moved to the opposite side of Bay, and most of them moved over there and eventually died in Duxbury, and had land in the Duxbury area. It's not that far. It's within walking distance of Plymouth, so it's not really that far away. You know, it's sort of like Wigan and Standish, you might say. It's fairly close together. Okay, any yes? I'm sorry?
Was there ever a settlement called Standish?
Yes, there are settlements. There's a Standish, Michigan, that I'm aware of. Now, Michigan, the Standish line that came to Michigan, actually were the descendants of Joshua, the youngest son of Myles, and they were all in the lumbering industry and settled in Michigan. And there is a Standish, Michigan. Now, some of the descendants of that line went to California, and they lumbered redwood trees in California. And there's a Myles Standish forest in Florida, or in California, that they donated to the State for Park. And in there's a Captain Myles Standish redwood tree that has been named for Captain Myles Standish. And it's hard to appreciate how big these redwood trees are. They are just enormous, and the trunk of the tree might fill the center of the chapel here. They're so big. But they were mostly in the lumbering industry, whereas my line were mostly in the shipbuilding, clipper ships, and that sort of thing during that period of time. Any other questions? Yes?
Have you always known that you were descending from Myles Standish? Is it a tradition that's been passed down, or was it something you discovered for yourself?
No, actually, I've always known that I was a descendant. I had an aunt that was a member of the Society of Mayflower Descendants, and so I knew from her. Now, my father never really talked about it very much, so I never really learned very much from my father. And in later years, I became interested, and I joined the Society of Mayflower Descendants. And in order to do that, you have to have all of your line of descent identified, and then the reference sources on all of those. When I filed my papers, I found out that my grandfather was a member. And I never really knew it because he never ever mentioned it to me, but obviously he was a member. Now, I've been a member